Hello and welcome to Retro Reviews, my channel where I review my favorite retro video games of all time as well as some modern releases I have recently finished. Today I want to look at my top 15 remakes of all time. Now I want to be clear, this is remakes and not remasters. So games like, I know this one maybe could be classified as a remake, but like Shadow of the Colossus on the PlayStation 4, I see as more of a remaster because it's not like a full reinvention or anything like that. I see that more of a remaster than a remake. You could argue for that one and I totally understand, and that one would definitely rank very high on my list because I love that game. But if I do a remasters list, and I definitely will at some point, that will definitely be up there on that list. So that one's not going to make the cut, as well as any other one that feels more like a remaster than like a full-on remake here. I wasn't going to do my top 10, but I had 5 that either I have like one that I don't have experience with at all, but I have so many people tell me it's so fantastic. I've played a little bit of it, but I never finished it. There's like that one I had to include on this list because of how like fantastic everyone says it is, and a couple of ones I either have like smaller experience with or they just barely didn't make the cut, and I decided, you know what, I'm just going to do a top 15 instead. So with that out of the way, let's start off with number 15, which is going to be the Final Fantasy VII Remake. This is the one that everybody that I've talked to has said this is a phenomenal remake. I don't know about the second one. A lot of people really loved it, but there isn't a great consensus between critics and users. A lot of people said it's really poorly paced for the second one, so I'll be talking about the first one here. My brother-in-law is a huge Final Fantasy fan, and he absolutely adores this game. I had a buddy of mine that really loved it as well, told me I should play it. I jumped into it, I started playing it for a while. I just couldn't keep going into it. So I plan on revisiting it later on, but I haven't up to this point. So I think it would definitely be higher on my list, but Final Fantasy is just not my bag. So once I get to it, maybe I'll do a retooling of this list later on. Number 14 is going to be the Pokemon games. You can take your pick, but this would be like Heart Gold and Soul Silver, or the Omega and Alpha games. I prefer Generation 3. Emerald is my favorite Pokemon game. So for my money, it's going to be the Alpha and Omega games. I think they're really darn fun. I think that the way that they did the remakes is really fantastic. I loved revisiting the worlds. I just had a really good time with this. I think revisiting nostalgia in this way is really fantastic, and putting it in the style of like the 3DS games like X and Y, I think was a really solid decision here. I also love thinking about the IGN review that gave it like a 7.6 for too much water. I just think that's so funny. It's absolutely hilarious. Number 13 is going to be the Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 remake. This one I was so over the moon for because I remember playing Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 on my Dreamcast, and it was just out of this world fun. I love that game so much. So to get a remake of 1 and 2, especially after the franchise just dipped in quality and like fell off a cliff with quality, actually, it's so nice to see them actually care about the franchise and bring some life back to it. The 1 and 2 remakes are so much fun to play through. I played through both of them. I had a phenomenal time. I loved getting to revisit my childhood in this way. I think they really recaptured the essence of the game and also made it look really visually appealing. I think they did a very good job overall. Number 12 is going to be Metroid Zero Mission. I really enjoy this game. I think this is the best way to play the original Metroid game. Though the original Metroid still definitely holds up, the remake definitely does wonders for it, especially being on the Game Boy Advance. I think this is like the perfect platform for Metroid games. If you put like every single Game Boy game like up to Fusion on the Game Boy Advance, I think it would run and look fantastic. I wish they would have done like a Super Metroid port at some point, but I really loved the Metroid Zero Mission remake here, especially since it introduced Zero Suit Samus, who's a character in Smash Brothers, played by Mars, a player I really enjoy. It's not like a huge section. They didn't add like a ton of content, but it does look and play significantly better than the original, so it's going to be here on this list. Number 11 is going to be the Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask remakes for the 3DS. You can take your pick here. I'm a Majora's Mask fan myself, but Ocarina of Time is also so stellar. On my Nintendo 64 list, they were very high up on my list. I really love what they did with these remakes here. Not only did they overhaul them visually and make them more like fitting on the 3DS, they also did a lot to balance some of the harder or more annoying dungeons like the Water Temple in both games, actually. They did some balancing, some retooling to make it less frustrating for both games. I think they did a phenomenal job. And the fact that you can take Ocarina of Time on the go was such a monumental idea. We were getting games for the Nintendo DS that were emulating 64 games. Essentially, they were doing remakes of it, like Super Mario 64 DS, and it was really fantastic. But to see a game like Ocarina of Time and then Majora's Mask make their way to a handheld console was revolutionary at the time. I still remember getting these games and playing through them and going, oh yeah, I do remember why this game was so much fun. So these will be here on this list. With that out of the way, let's get into the top 10 here with number 10, which is going to be Black Mesa. This is a really cool remake because it wasn't made by Valve. This was a fan project to remake the original Half-Life game, one of the greatest games of all time. And they started remaking it. It started looking really fantastic. And Valve, in their infinite wisdom, since they're really cool as a company, decided not to shut this project down, but instead to say, yeah, let's make this an official like remake that you do your thing. We're gonna let you sell it on Steam, and it's fantastic. I have not played through the entirety of it yet, but I have made significant progress into it. I don't play on my computer all that often, but I do really enjoy Black Mesa so far. I think visually it looks absolutely gorgeous. One of the hardest things about going back and playing older games, especially ones that are kind of dated in their controls specifically, is that they just don't feel very good to play. They don't have the modern conventions that you're used to. Black Mesa does a lot to make it feel more modern, and the visuals look phenomenal. Most remakes make the visuals look fantastic, but I think this one does it incredibly well. So that's going to be number 10 on my list. Number 9 is going to be Ratchet & Clank 2016 for the PlayStation 4. This is an interesting one because it's like a remake of the original on the PlayStation 2, but also a remake of the movie, which was a like retelling of the first game. It's really funny how they did this, but it's a phenomenal outing. I think this is one of the best Ratchet & Clank games in the entire series. I think this is the best way to revisit the franchise. Like going back and playing some of the older ones, again, modern conventions make games a lot easier to play. Playing older games on like the PlayStation 2 era can be really fun. Sometimes the controls don't work as well, or it doesn't look as visually appealing. This one does everything right by a remake. It's almost like a great reboot for the franchise as well, since it kind of stagnated toward the end of the like PlayStation 3 life cycle. We didn't see it for several years, and then suddenly we get a remake of the original game, and now we have a sequel to that with Rift Apart. I really love the 2016 game. This is one of those games that I finished and immediately jumped back into and played an entire new file to get the final trophies I needed, and I had a blast playing through it twice in a row. It's so good. If you've not played the Ratchet & Clank series at all, this is the best place to jump in. Number 8 is going to be Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes for the Nintendo GameCube. I have not played any of the Metal Gear games outside of Metal Gear Solid on the Game Boy Color, which I thoroughly enjoyed, but I did watch my brother play through Twin Snakes, and I remember it being such a phenomenal experience. Now, I've seen footage of the original on the PlayStation 1, and that game still holds up pretty darn well to this day. It looks very visually appealing, but the GameCube version just takes that up several notches. It not only looks better, but it plays a lot better as well. I'm actually pretty baffled that this version didn't make it onto the Master Collection Volume 1. I'm really surprised that Konami left it out. I think it's bizarre. Maybe it's a rights thing, but the fact that it's just languishing on the Nintendo GameCube is a little bit sad, because this is definitely the best way to play Metal Gear Solid 1. I'd really like to see this one get ported over, to see all of the fights, especially like the Psycho Mantis and some of the other fights, I'm blanking on the names of the characters at this point, to see them in like a much better light with better visuals, better facial animations is just a 100% a treat. I plan on revisiting this one very soon. Number 7 is going to be Resident Evil 1. This is the remake on the Nintendo GameCube. This is a similar thing where not only are their visuals improved, but they are substantially better than the PlayStation 1 counterpart. Now, I think the old Resident Evil games are phenomenal. I think Resident Evil 1 and 2 on the PlayStation look and play fantastically, but this just made everything so much more smooth and kind of gave us the visual style for the series moving forward. And I think they did a phenomenal job with it. This is kind of the precursor to Resident Evil 4, and I think they did a good job of prepping everybody for it while retaining what made the original so fantastic. Mainly like the tank controls, the tight areas, the fixed camera angles that gave the scares much more gravity. I think they just really knocked it out of the park with this one. I don't typically like to repeat franchises on lists, but I will spoil here. This is not the last you'll see of Resident Evil, because they do such a good job. I think Capcom has done such a phenomenal job of remaking the series over time. Number 6 is going to be Link's Awakening for the Nintendo Switch. Link's Awakening on the Game Boy is one of my favorite games in the entire franchise. I really love how wonderful it is to move around. The fact that this is on the Game Boy and then the Game Boy Color with the DX version is really fantastic to me, because it plays much more like a Game Boy Advance game. It feels very ahead of its time. The fact that you can like get something that makes you jump, that the dungeon design was really fantastic and really like, I think fairly advanced for its time. Again, I think this one just feels like like an era ahead of its time. And I really love what they did with the remake too. I think the new style is really cool. I like the toy aesthetic. I think it's really charming and fantastic. I'm really happy that the game, again, it doesn't languish on just a single console. You could buy it on virtual consoles like on the 3DS, so it was available, but the fact that they have a remake to bring it into the limelight more fully in the modern day is really fantastic. And I think they really knocked it out of the park. From start to finish, it does feel like a very faithful remake of the original game, and everything that I love about it as well. Number 5 is going to be Demon's Souls for the PlayStation 5. This one is really high up on my list because of how fantastic it is compared to the original. I think the original game is really, really good. I think it's one of the most underrated in all of the From Software catalog for sure. But some of the things that kind of bog it down, especially are like it's the rolling mechanic. You can only roll 4 directions, and the rolling feels kind of clunky. You can die a lot easier just to some jank, like falling off of things. It does feel like a product of its time, a very early version of the From Software formula. That's not a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination, but I think what they did with the remake on the PlayStation 5 just like smooths out all of the troubles that the original had and gives us one of the best looking games I have ever played on a console. In fact, I think to this day, this is probably still the best looking game on the PlayStation 5. You could maybe argue a couple others, but for my money, I remember booting this up for the very first time. My wife has a picture of me looking like jaw agape, just staring at the screen. She thinks it's so funny. I just really remember how visually stunning this game was, and it's a treat from start to finish. This is one of the most accessible games in the From Software catalog, and the fact that they brought it into, again, the modern day with more modern conventions is just a great testament to the team that brought it to the PlayStation 5. Number 4 is going to be the Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy. This one definitely counts as a remake in my eyes because the whole visual overhaul, the systems were more like streamlined. I know some people had issue with this because the jumping between games in the original, like on the PlayStation 1, jumping and momentum vary differently between Crash 1, 2, and 3. They evened this out and made it consistent across each and every game, so you wouldn't have like a jarring transition between 1, 2, and 3, which for me, who didn't really play the originals, didn't really have a chance because I never had a PlayStation growing up, was fantastic. It all felt a nice, smooth a thing across the board. I know for some people that's going to be a little bit different because you have your muscle memory ingrained, but for my money, I think that was a really good decision, and it just looks and plays so fantastic. It is every bit as aggravating as I'm sure everybody experienced back on the PlayStation 1. There are so many levels in all these games that made me rage so hard, but I was so determined. I got the Platinum Trophy on every single one of these games in the Insane Trilogy. I had such a good time finally getting every trophy, including the DLC that they added on for Crash Bandicoot 1 with I think it was the slippery slope or the slippery climb, whatever it is. That level was so hard, especially getting the Platinum Relic for that. I think they did a phenomenal job, knocked out of the park. I think Toys for Bob really ought to be commended for that a lot more than they are even. Number 3 is going to be Metroid Return of Samus for the 3DS. I love the Metroid series. I think it's out of this world phenomenal. I think every single game, outside of Federation Forces, but that is not a Metroid game. I don't care if it has the Metroid moniker on it. That has nothing to do with Metroid. Every game in the series is really, really good. Even Prime Hunters on the Nintendo DS. Like, they really just do such a good job with the series, especially in the 2D realm. And the second game on the Game Boy is really phenomenal. I love how it plays. But the remake does so much, again, to make it more accessible, because that game is incredibly hard to just find out where you're trying to go, because the mapping is so crazy. There's no clear indication of where you're supposed to go. You might spend hours just searching for your next objective. It's that obtuse at times. Metroid Return of Samus eliminates that altogether, but also introduces a bevy of new features, including the counter system and aiming systems, grabbing onto ledges and such. They do so much to make this distinct from the original, and I think they killed it. They did everything right by this remake. It is so much fun. The boss fights are phenomenal. The exploration is unmatched pretty much up to that point. They really did a bang-up job of this remake. Number 2 is going to be Dead Space on the PlayStation 5. This one mostly benefits from being a next generation exclusive, and this is the stuff I want to see going forward for any franchise. I want to see these next generation exclusives because they just flow so beautifully. For a game like Dead Space that is so immersive and terrifying, to have it so you don't have loading screens, you don't have these things that really take you out of the experience, it is a huge treat. And I think the horror franchise really benefits from remakes the most because they have so much more in terms of visual scares that they can do, but also to make the experience a lot more smooth. And I'm so pleased that the Dead Space remake was so good. I remember thinking that the Callisto Protocol was going to be the game I was going to buy, and the Dead Space remake was going to suck, and it ended up flip-flopping. EA really killed it. They absolutely nailed it. It makes me really want a Dead Space 2 remake. I hope they pursue it because the Dead Space remake right now is one of the best games that you can play on the market, period, for current generation. So if you have not tried it and you love horror, now is the time to do it. With that out of the way, let's get down to number 1, which is going to be Resident Evil 2 or 4. I know this is a little bit cheating because I definitely could have included both of these on my list, but I didn't want this to have a ton of Resident Evil games on it. So you can take your pick. For my money, the Resident Evil 2 remake is a little bit better than Resident Evil 4 remake. In my hierarchy for my top whatever Resident Evil titles, I have 4, the original, at the top of my list, Resident Evil 2 remake right at number 2, and the Resident Evil 4 remake at number 3. I absolutely adore these games. I think the franchise is just so phenomenal. Not every game hits, of course. You have 5 and 6 that are not nearly as good as any of the other games in the franchise. I know people have some criticisms with 3 as well, but for my money, I just absolutely love the Resident Evil 2 remake. It does so much to differentiate itself from the original that it's essentially an entirely different experience. Resident Evil 4 does a similar thing as well, where it's very faithful to the original, where it has a lot of the same story beats, but it remixes a lot to keep you on your toes, so you don't really know what to expect. It also overhauls the aiming system for both of these games. Resident Evil 2 is the first one to do this, making it like you don't have laser pointing, you don't have like Resident Evil 4 on the GameCube, you don't have the tank controls, you don't have to be looking at fixed camera angles or anything. You have a reticle that zeroes in. If the more you hold still, the better your aim is going to be. You don't have guaranteed hits. I think that is such a phenomenal thing for a horror game because you shouldn't have guaranteed hits. You should be terrified. You should be trying to hit your headshots, but if they move out of the way at the last second and you miss, you will be absolutely terrified because, oh no, I might just lose my life here. I think that's so fantastic, and I love the way they did that in Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 4. The AI itself is so much better. The scares are so much better as well, and I think the story beats and the way that they do the voice acting and everything, they just really knock it out of the park. So take your pick. For my money, it's Resident Evil 2. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comment section down below what your favorite remakes are. And if I left out anything, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.